Hello, my name's Roger Watson. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Nurse Education and Practice, and welcome to this session on better writing techniques. In this session, I'm going to look at a variety of aspects of writing scientific manuscripts and ways in which you can make your writing better. This is really based on the types of things that arise when I'm editing manuscripts and the kind of things I've learned about writing better manuscripts. It's not comprehensive. It's not meant to be about writing English as a foreign language or necessarily about writing English. It's principally about ways of making your manuscripts more acceptable to editors, reviewers, and ultimately to readers. One of the things that we tend to do when we write is we write too much. Too many adjectives, too many adverbs, and so forth. And really what we've got to try and do, and one of the things I'm going to emphasize here, is cut out the clutter, cut down the words, try not to use unnecessary words. And that is the main theme of what I'm going to talk about today, but not exclusively so. One of the problems that we have, especially at university amongst us academics, is that we teach people to write badly, and therefore students learn to write badly. There's a book called Learn to Write Badly, and Michael Billig wrote this, and it was reviewed in the Times Higher Education by Sandra Gray. And she said, "We train our postgraduates to use ever lengthier words and ever clunkier concepts as a means of promoting their work, and more importantly, to make ourselves look clever and erudite. We hide sloppy research designs and reporting behind the use of the passive tense." A classic example of the passive tense is the study shows, the research was done, the researchers did, that kind of thing. We've really got to try and avoid this and use more direct language. More direct language helps us to, as it said in the first slide, cut the clutter and use more concise writing. Poor writing style involves poor presentation, making a mess of things and using changes in font, for example, and not aligning things properly. That's one example of poor writing style. And it's just almost as important as writing good English. An editor looking at a manuscript that's poorly put together will undoubtedly reject it. Most of us are guilty of using more words than necessary. There's hardly a piece of writing that cannot be reduced to some extent. We also use longer words than necessary. And we use jargon and cliches. And we've got to try to minimize or even avoid these things altogether. And we also use ambiguous and flowery language. We've got to use very direct, very clear language when we're writing, especially writing scientific papers. We should try to use clear, simple writing, and the two boxes on the bottom demonstrate this to some extent. Top one says, with what frequency has your child experienced a raised temperature within the last 30 days? This not only uses too many words, it might be hard to understand by some people, especially lay people. The bottom box says exactly the same thing in fewer words and much more clear language. How many times has your child had a fever in the last month? So, often the first word that comes to mind is the right one. Don't strive to think of a better, longer one. Try to avoid using polysyllabic words. Try not to say automobile when you mean car. And don't use jargon. Peter Barry said, "It is the writer's job to make the reader interested. No reader owes us a reading." If somebody looks at what we've written and sees aspects of it that they don't like or don't understand, they'll put it down. You know how you feel yourself when you read a book that's written in complex language. You sometimes will struggle on with it, but sometimes you will just put it down and you won't read it again. Either way, you won't enjoy it. Now this is meant to be funny. Don't use a big word when a singularly unloquacious and diminutive linguistic expression will satisfactorily accomplish the contemporary necessity. it's funny because it's very difficult to understand. It also says the opposite from what it means. In terms of style, Ian Rankin, very famous crime writer, said, "The style's got to be invisible. If something jars or a phrase is too flowery, suddenly the reader is aware that someone's writing a book. Some people speak about developing a writing style. I think we should try to do exactly the opposite. I'm not trying to say we should be boring or bland. There are ways of making your writing interesting, but it's not by developing a style and using particularly big words or particular phrases. Some writers are very guilty of that, and you see the same phrases and the same rather unusual expressions coming up in some people's writings." Orhan Pamuk, very famous Turkish writer, said, "Imperfection is the mother of style." And you've got to think about this for a while. What he means is that people develop a style through their own little imperfections in writing, and really we've got to strive to try and get away those imperfections, the long words, the awkward phrases, the unnecessary words that we use over and over again. Now, I'm not going to try and exaggerate this too much. All editors edit manuscripts. If they like the science and it's reasonably well written, they'll take it. They won't reject it if it's not perfectly written, but I can assure you the better written something is, the more likely it is to get past the editors and the reviewers. We've really got to strive at every stage to try and get our writing as clear and as crisp and concise as we possibly can. This is an excellent book by Helen Sword called Stylish Academic Writing. I'd really recommend that you get a hold of it if you can. It's actually an academic study of writing in various disciplines, including nursing. A lot of the writing comes from medicine as well. And all of the examples in the book are real examples taken from people's writing that's been published. So sometimes poor, flowery writing does get through, but she gives good examples of good writing, good examples of writing that isn't so good. Now, Helen Sword, who's an academic at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, has an excellent website called The Writer's Diet. You can go there and find out nearly everything that she has to say about good academic writing. You can also put in sections of your own writing and it will come back with a check and tell you where it could be better. And I have to say I use this now and again, and I always find something that can be improved. She's got a concept called zombie nouns, the ones that really add nothing to the text, and I have to say that I am very guilty of using those. So, The Writer's Diet, well worth checking. But in the book she mentions various aspects of writing, things that you've got to perhaps pay attention to make your writing better. Some of these are easier said than done. I'm not going to exemplify them all, they're just points that you can be thinking of. She says you've got to go for clarity, coherence, concision. Basically strive to produce sentences that are clear, coherent and concise, self-explanatory. And the way to do this is to read them over yourself and get somebody else to read them over. It's not too difficult. Short or mixed length sentences. Keep sentences short and simple, or vary your rhythm by alternating longer sentences with short ones. This is very true. Try not to write extensive, certainly paragraph-long sentences. There's no absolute rule about this, but I would say a sentence that goes on for 4 or 5 lines on A4 paper, size 12 font, is probably too long. Try to break them up a bit. And English is strange. It works with a rhythm, and sometimes you can do this or achieve this by having short sentences and long sentences, and you can get a feel for it. Some people do this by reading it out aloud. I tend not to do that, but some people find that very useful. Basic message here, though, is try not to use sentences that are too long. I'll say this all the way through, and I'm going to give some specific examples in a minute, but avoid ornate, pompous, and latinate or waffly prose. Use plain English. Again, if you have any doubts about it, give it to someone else to read. Can they understand it? Try to be precise, avoid vagueness and imprecision. This is very important in scientific writing. Write it in such a way that a reviewer will know exactly what you've done and a reader can follow exactly what you've done and repeat it. Simple as that. Try to avoid passive verbs and or use them very sparingly. Active verbs should certainly predominate, and I will give an example of this later. This is not so easy to explain, but try telling a story. Create a compelling narrative. I work with a very senior academic who always says, after we've done a study, what's the story? What's the story we're trying to tell here? So think of what the story is. You're not just trying to fill boxes or stack the shelves, as it were, within an academic article. You're trying to make it run from beginning to end. And the most essential or characteristic feature of a story, long, short, or an essay, is that it's got a beginning, a middle, and an end. To try to make it interesting and compelling. Here's a great example of poor writing. Rarely is there an effective conceptual link between the current understanding of the centrality of text to knowledge production and student learning and the pragmatic problems of policy imperatives in the name of efficiency and capacity building. I guess it means something. I don't know what it means, because by the end of the sentence I've given up trying to think what it means, and I haven't got the time to go back and find out what it means. That's a terrible sentence. So it gets this label. What? George Orwell, a very famous British writer, a journalist and novelist and essayist, had 5 rules for effective writing. There's a website containing these, but they're available on several websites with several examples. Never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech which you are used to seeing in print. Read that again. Never use a metaphor, simile, or other figure of speech which you are used to seeing in print. Some people misinterpret this as meaning use ones that you're used to seeing and avoid ones that you're not. It means exactly the opposite. So try not to use hackneyed phrases. Try not to use the journalistic headline phrases. Examples are towing the line, riding roughshod over, standing shoulder to shoulder, etc. Play into the hands of, Achilles heel, swan song, hotbed. Lots of examples like this, and they're okay for rhetoric and speeches and rabble rousing, but they've got no place in any kind of writing, especially in academic writing. Never use a long word where a short one will do. Long words don't make you sound intelligent unless used skillfully, I would say sparingly. In the wrong situation, they'll have the opposite effect of making you sound pretentious and arrogant. They're also less likely to be understood and more awkward to read. If you don't understand the word yourself as well, and sometimes we wrongly use words, you may look stupid. If it's possible to cut a word out, always cut it out, and I'm going to show you some very specific examples of this towards the end of the session. Ezra Pound said, "Great literature is simply language charged with meaning to the utmost possible degree. In other words, words that don't contribute meaning to a passage dilute its power. Less is always better, always. Some people argue this point, and they've argued with me, and I will always argue back. Anyway, the editor's always got the final say, but less is always better. If you can cut it out, cut it out. And sometimes you have to cut it out because you've got a word limit to reach, and if you don't cut the words out, you will not get published." Never use a passive where you can use the active. Frequently broken. One example of a passive piece of writing is "the man was bitten by the dog," and the active equivalent is "the dog bit the man." Much more clear what's happening there, but the great thing is it uses fewer words. Never use a foreign phrase or a scientific word or a jargon word if you can think of an everyday English equivalent. There's no examples here, but we've said this and done this one to death already. Use plain English. Now, I mentioned presentation earlier. Make your paper look like an academic paper. Make it look like something that the editor expects to see. Journals give you specific guidance on how to present your manuscript, and sometimes, for example, they say it should be presented according to the APA guidance, the American Psychological Association guidance, and a paper should only look one particular way if it's done in that style. And it's a very nice style, very easy to read, it's very clear where everything is. If you don't present it like that, especially with American journals, and especially with journals in the field of psychology, it will simply be rejected. Now, many publishers, Wiley, Elsevier and so forth, are now using the APA guidance for nursing papers. Paragraphs shouldn't be too short. There's no rule as such, but a paragraph should contain a few sentences, all of which refer to the same subject. However, sometimes it's simply the case that you need to find a break and break your writing up into paragraphs. There's nothing worse than writing that starts at the top left of a page and goes to the bottom right and goes on for several pages like that. So paragraphs is often about aesthetics and appearance as much as meaning. We've already said sentences shouldn't be too long. And use verbal signposts. Don't overuse it. You've got to watch how many words you use, but try to link things and say, next I will say, I will argue that, in conclusion, these kind of things. Try to end one section within the next section, we'll deal with this, and at the beginning of that section, this section covers. Just ways of joining your writing together. That helps to create a narrative, and it certainly helps to keep the flow. Avoid jargon. We need to acknowledge ourselves how seductive it is. We try to bamboozle, obfuscate and impress, and those of us in the medical field and in nursing are very, very guilty of this. Again, meant to be a joke, but some people think that jargon is used deliberately to make things obscure. Here's a couple of people saying, we need some new jargon, the public are starting to understand what we're talking about. Well, we want to do the opposite with our writing. We want everybody to understand what we're talking about. Next up, as they say, cliches, very closely related to jargon. Things like at the end of the day, the bottom line, swept under the carpet. These are cliches, things that we use all the time in speech. And I consider these to be what a nutritionist would call empty calories, basically. They are words and phrases that add nothing to it, and they use too many words. At the end of the day means in the end, the bottom line means essentially, swept under the carpet just means ignored. Ambiguous language, it's difficult to give examples here. These are a little bit facetious, but to avoid pressure sores, the patients were turned regularly. People in tissue viability don't like this because turning someone means to put them back in the same position. They prefer positional change. That's a more accurate way of explaining it. The nurses were revolting, could mean that they were disgusting or that they were in revolt about pay or something, for example. And we had the children for dinner. Doesn't mean to say we ate the children for dinner, but it could mean that. So I'm just saying that read through your writing, question every phrase. If you think, oh, that could be interpreted wrongly, change it so that it won't be. If you're in any doubt, get someone else to read it and they'll soon tell you what's wrong with your writing. Another argument is about the first or the third person. The argument's settled. In academic publishing, publishers are quite happy with the first person. It's the house style in many publishing houses. The most famous scientific paper ever published, in my view, 1953 by Watson and Crick in Nature about the DNA double helix begins, we wish to propose a structure for the salt of deoxyribonucleic acid, first person plural. So don't be afraid to use the first person. Clearly, if a journal editor gets back and says you can't use this, you've got to change it, but I doubt they will. For example, we hypothesized is better than it was hypothesized. It's also direct. It's not passive. It's active. I recruited interviewees is better than the researcher recruited interviewees. Exactly the same principle. And it uses fewer words as well. We found is better than it was found. Some other miscellaneous points. Dashes, I consider these very good. I consider it's not worth your time agonizing over punctuation, whether it should be a colon, semicolon, full stop or a bracket. Use a dash. Now use the M dash. That's this particular long dash. In Word you can achieve this by putting in 2 hyphens and a carriage return. So they're perfectly acceptable. As I say, don't agonize over the punctuation. With hyphens, the basic message is be consistent. Don't mix and match. That conveys to the editor and the reviewers that you're not very sure. So be consistent. Even if you're wrong, it's easy to correct, but it's very difficult to correct if you're not consistent. Capital letters are mostly unnecessary unless it's proper names. Registered nurse, for instance, does need one. Nursing care, diabetes, cardiac arrest, these sort of things don't need capitals, but for some reason we use them. Don't use apostrophes in academic writing unless it's a direct quote. Try to avoid question marks unless it's the actual research question, and I don't particularly like to see these in titles. The title should be a statement of what's been done rather than a question. Exclamation marks have absolutely no place in academic writing. Here's another book, The Smart Way by Zilman Entwistle. It's an introduction to writing for nurses, but it could be for anyone really. And there's 1 or 2 things I want to pull out of that now, which are an aid to more concise writing. And I've added to some of these, so they're not solely from this book. So common mistakes is the use of compared to instead of compared with. When we do a clinical trial, we compare one thing with another, not to it. Data is instead of data are. Data remains plural, whatever you think. Which and that can be confusing. Which is the unrestrictive. Dogs which bite are dangerous. That's any dog. Restrictive. Dogs that bite. Specific dogs that bite are dangerous. Again, it's what I'm really trying to get across here is that some people think it's better to use which than that all the time. That's not correct. That is perfectly correct under some circumstances. Affect and effect get mixed up. Between and among. 2 people speak between themselves. More than 2 speak among themselves. Now, towards the end of using shorter words, here are some examples that I've drawn up. It's by no means exhaustive. You can probably add more yourself. I always try to use in rather than within, unless I'm speaking about limits. No need to use upon. On will always do. Utilize shouldn't be used. It's use. Why use numerous when you can say many? Demonstrate when you can show. Reside when you can use live. Remainder, just use rest. Voluminous, big, large. Why say endeavour when you can try? These are good examples of polysyllabic words which you don't need. And likewise, towards the end of using fewer words, I'll run through some of the examples. These are ones that I tend to edit out. Rather than the maintenance of, I tend to use maintaining. Similarly, the development of, developing. In relation to, with regard to, lots of these phrases that people use. About often replaces that. It would seem that, apart from being ambiguous, uses too many words. Just say it seems that. A number of can nearly always be replaced by several or some. In order to is usually unnecessary. One word to will do. Something's true to say. It is true. In which, and I'll give examples following this, in which can often be missed out completely. If you're of the opinion, you think it. Period of time can just be time or maybe just period, but one word will do. And finally, the majority of can be replaced by most. So some examples. Don't use the ways in which this is achieved, just say the ways this is achieved. Don't use over a period of 5 years, just say over 5 years. Don't use nevertheless. It's possible for anyone to. Say, nevertheless, anyone can. In Smith's study it was shown. Much better to say Smith showed. These results are in agreement with. These results agree with. I'm sure you're getting the idea by now. Use plurals to avoid repetition in awkward phrases. For example, nurses should always ask patients to give their consent before starting to give care is better than the nurse should always ask the patient to give his/her consent before starting to give care. The his/her is awkward. No need to use it. Try to avoid the. Nurses develop good relationships with patients. It's better than the nurses develop good relationships with the patients. Try to avoid repetition. For example, women told us that their symptoms were improved and those in the intervention group reported less fatigue is better than women told us that their symptoms were improved and women in the intervention group reported less fatigue. So you can use a different word. It just is clumsy and it looks very bad having women and women underneath on the consecutive lines there. From Helen's sword, try to avoid there. This is a terrible sentence, by the way. If the nomocentric principle is correct, then there are as many true backward counterfactual conditions as there are forward counterfactual conditions, etc. It is actually a sensible sentence. It's a little bit long for my liking. Good alternative is to take out the there's, put exist at the end of the sentence and a full stop, and that breaks it down nicely into two sentences. So if the nomocentric principle is correct, then as many true backward counterfactual conditions as forward counterfactual conditionals exist. Try to avoid that. Again from Helen's sword, you can see all of the that's can simply go. Now these next few slides are actual exercises in cutting down words. These are sentences that I wrote a long time ago for an article, wrote them very quickly and then worked to get them down. And what I did was I actually kept the examples and used them to demonstrate how I cut down the writing. So here's a sentence with 28 words. The way in which people write is of considerable interest, especially to nurses, because they are increasingly required to make and present arguments in writing to other people. Makes perfect sense, but there's too many words there. So in which can go. Considerable. Try to get rid of superlatives. Increasingly. Again, get rid of the superlative. So 10 words gone means exactly the same thing. The way people write is of interest to nurses because they're required to present arguments in writing. You don't need to say it's in writing to other people, that's implied. "50 words. Nurses may be asked to write for a variety of different purposes. They may be asked to write case notes, they may be asked to write reports from their areas of clinical responsibility, they may be asked to write a research report, they may be asked to write for publication." I think you can see the obvious targets there, the repetition. A variety of different purposes is a good target because if there's a variety of different purposes, it's different purposes or a variety of purposes. So all of those can be got rid of. And in fact, I replaced variety of purposes with many reasons, so 50 words down to 28. Nurses may be asked to write for many reasons. They may be asked to write case notes, reports on their areas of clinical responsibility, research reports and publications. It means exactly the same thing. People often put their hand up when I'm presenting this live and say, I could cut out more words there. Good. I'm quite happy if you want to do that. Here's a good one, 88 words, one sentence. I shan't read that out. I think you get the idea, and you can probably tell instantly that it's far too long. This is exactly what you got to do. Go through changing sentence by sentence and trying to create sentences. So 80 words down to 52 words and 5 sentences, and it makes exactly the same sense as the previous sentence. An initial problem for inexperienced writers is presenting relatively simple concepts. They use sentences which are too long with too many ideas. They use bad grammar and poor sentence construction. By the time the reader reaches the end of the sentence, the point has been lost. Single sentence paragraphs are also a mistake. You can see what I'm doing here. I'm actually writing about poor writing and use it as an example of how to get rid of unnecessary words. That's everything I want to say about better writing techniques. By no means exhaustive. I'd like to point you towards Nurse, Author and Editor, edited by Leslie Nichol on behalf of the International Academy of Nursing Editors, also known as INANE, and this is supported by Wiley. This is mainly contributed to by authors on some fairly prosaic aspects of writing for publication, for example, how to write an introduction to a paper, how to start a discussion, but also higher level concepts such as open access, open science, predatory publishing and so forth. It's free. You can get regular alerts by putting your email address in there, but you can go direct to Nurse, Author and Editor and gain access to the content that way. I would strongly urge you to look at it. It's full of very useful information. That's my email. If you've got any subsequent questions or comments, you can check my own publications and research record on ORCID. If you want, you can follow me on Twitter, or you can keep in contact with me by WeChat. I hope you found that session useful. Thank you very much for listening.